On September 9th, 2018, the LDS Church had a face-to-face event with Apostle Quentin L. Cook and historians Matt Groh and Kate Holbrook, focusing on LDS history and its new novel, Saints. Saints claims to help readers safely through the gap between naive faith and informed, mature faith. Let's see what the new historical narrative of the Church does to mature the naive faith of its members.
Earlier this week, the Church released in 14 languages a new history book called Saints, the story of the Church of Jesus Christ in the latter days. This narrative history tells the story of ordinary people who became saints through the atonement of Jesus Christ. Though it reads like a novel, the story is not fiction.
While it is true that Saints is based on actual events, it has the same flaw as every church-produced history before it. It has been sanitized to the point that it may as well be fiction. It may acknowledge certain facts that were formerly considered anti-Mormon lies, such as the seer stones, but intentionally leaves out the reason why these facts are concerning. Seer stones, for example, were used by Joseph in the practice of money digging, where he would go on late-night treasure hunts and pretend to see treasures hidden deep below the surface of the earth for a fee. No treasure was ever found by his guidance. Glass-looking was considered fraudulent, and it was illegal to practice it. Joseph was taken to court by the sons of Josiah Stoll, who were concerned that their father had been conned out of real money in pursuit of fool's gold. These details provide the necessary context to explain the later emphasis on the Urim and Thummim in church history and the replacement of the seer stone, until even apostles believed that seer stones were a harmful myth. This is the type of context that would make Saints a history rather than a fiction.
Church history can be a significant source of faith, but for some it's been misunderstood or overlooked, and some have been obscured and crowded out by larger concerns of the world. Some people have even purposely misrepresented stories of the past to sow doubt. In learning more, we will bind our hearts together with saints of yesterday and today. We will find examples of imperfect people who went forward with faith and allowed God to work through them to accomplish His work.
The word imperfect is frequently used as a euphemism for behavior that would more accurately be described as deplorable. Joseph was discovered to have had a secret relationship with his teenage housemaid, Fanny Alger, by his wife Emma, who threw Fanny out of the house. While the exact nature of the relationship is fiercely debated, it is a fact that Emma was not told and had to discover Joseph's infidelity on her own. The LDS essay on plural marriage admits that Emma likely didn't know about all of Joseph's sealings. Again, regardless of the nature of these sealings, intimate or otherwise, this shows infidelity and dishonesty that is more than mere imperfection. It was a pattern of dishonesty and infidelity to his only legal wife and the mother of his children. This is just one example of the type of imperfection we are being asked to excuse.
This face-to-face broadcast is to inform and answer questions with an emphasis on church history. We thank you for the thousands of questions we've received over the past months. We will answer as many as we can to give our perspective on the history of the church. Time will permit us to answer only a few of your questions, but we invite you to find answers in the new Saints book and in other credible sources. One of the places you can find answers is Institute, where you will find dedicated teachers who care about you and want to help you deepen your faith in Jesus Christ.
While Institute may provide some room for tough historical questions, it will always fall to the instructor to determine which questions are relevant and which are better asked at a more appropriate time and place. Having attended seminary and Institute myself, I am skeptical that these challenging questions would be welcome, let alone discussed to the satisfaction of someone struggling with the topic. Perhaps there has been, or will be, a shift towards such open discussion of church history-based doubts in seminary or Institute, but I would be very surprised.
Why isn't the church more open about some of the controversial things that happened at the start of the church? I have learned a lot of new things I did not know before, and I've been a member of the church my whole life. Some of the things I've learned have caused me to struggle with doubts and have no clear idea on where to get real answers.
I was raised an only child by my mother and my grandmother. And when I was 4 years old, they worked at the Beehive House, Brigham Young's old house. And they taught me all about Brigham Young, and they taught me that he had many wives. About 10 years later, my grandma read a book about Joseph and Emma Smith. And I learned while she was reading that book and talking about it that Joseph Smith had many wives. I didn't learn about seer stones, which Joseph Smith used to help translate the Book of Mormon, until I was an adult. And I was interested in church history and talking with people about it and reading with people about it. What I'm trying to get across is the church did not hide information from me, but the historical information was not emphasized to me.
I appreciate the open discussion of Joseph's polygamy here. I can't count the number of times that kids have emphatically commented on my videos that Joseph only had one wife. I believed that myself until I was completely blindsided by that revelation in the MTC. Perhaps if church media were more honest in its portrayal of Joseph's life, people wouldn't have to discover these kinds of facts well into adulthood. It is not difficult to portray these details in church media, it's just uncomfortable. When members have to find out about Joseph's polygamy and use of seer stones from outside sources, it may not be an example of the church intentionally hiding information, but it certainly is a failure of the church to properly and accurately portray their history.
It can be really painful to learn about something that you thought you should have known and that you didn't know. That's why Matt and I do the work we do. I hope that experience for people will now become a part of the past, because we have the book Saints that portrays a full history for people, and we also have gospel topics essays and other information online.
As I said before, Saints is far from the full history. It sprinkles in some of what was formerly sanitized, but will still leave members woefully unprepared for the full picture of LDS history that they will inevitably encounter online. This book is only setting them up for disappointment when they realize details were intentionally omitted or glossed over.
Information has been available, especially to those with an interest, and sometimes in church publications, but some of the more challenging information hasn't been emphasized, hasn't been taught or discussed much, sometimes because it feels uncomfortable, and sometimes because the main purpose of church meetings is to preach the gospel of salvation.
I understand that church might not be the ideal place to discuss polyandry, seer stones, or the priesthood ban. That said, why has there never been an approved time in place sanctioned and set aside by the church for such extracurricular or historical topics? Until that happens, you can't use the excuse that the member could have known about these things that were always out there. How could they even know to ask about Joseph's polyandry unless you introduced them to the topic first? Again, you set members up to stumble when you don't specifically warn them about these things, and they will still stumble if you attempt to make the problem seem smaller than it is.
So sometimes what seems that the church has hidden information is simply a result of the fact that we know more now. But we do live in a new reality of the information age, when challenging information on church history can appear in social media feeds of members all around the world. And so we have a heightened responsibility now to help members find good answers to their questions. And Kate mentioned that the church is trying to do a lot of that in Saints. I would also mention the Joseph Smith Papers, which is this massive historical project to publish all of Joseph's journals and letters and other documents. It's all available online, josephsmithpapers.org, and it already fills 17 thick books. In addition, the Gospel Topics essays, which Kate mentioned, confront directly many of these challenging doctrinal and historical questions. The message to me of this openness is that the history of the church can withstand scrutiny. We don't need to be afraid of it. It's inspiring. Sometimes we'll have questions, but there are good answers.
The church acts as if every historical problem has a solution that neutralizes it. However, members continue to leave the church over these issues. It is not for a lack of research or for missing the faithful perspective. Many members read the essays or Fair Mormon and come away feeling even more doubt than they had before. Sometimes a bad thing is just bad. The Meadows Massacre was just a terrible, senseless tragedy sparked by violent zealotry taught in LDS temples. The priesthood ban was just a terribly racist and harmful practice spawned by ignorance and prejudice. These problems don't have good answers. The only good answer is an admission of wrong and an apology that is yet overdue.
I want to assure you, in the over 22 years that I've been a general authority, that the desire of the brethren has been to be as transparent as possible, both in terms of church history and in doctrine. And we feel like that the effort to put forth these new resources, particularly the Joseph Smith Papers, the gospel topic essays, and now saints are a wonderful way of having people get into things that are true and are in context, and will help you understand the gospel of Jesus Christ in a credible way. So thank you very much.
If the goal of the Brethren for 22 years had been transparency, saints, or some similar effort should have come out 16 years ago. Instead, we've had the same correlated and whitewashed history that was dispensed since the 1940s. Every church film has depicted Joseph and Emma as blissfully monogamous. LDS artwork has put forth the same inaccurate Book of Mormon translation method for decades. The words of former prophets have been buried deep enough to pretend that polygamy was never considered necessary for salvation. Today's transparency came in a panicked reaction to the threat of the internet, not due to a shared benevolent interest among the brethren in bringing lost truth to light.
Anthony asks, as the church becomes more global, how will the new history of the church include members from around the world, and what kinds of stories do we have to look forward to in the upcoming volumes of the new church history?
The destiny of this church is to fill North America and South America and the entire world. And we're seeing that, and I think my reference to 600,000 of you going on missions, many in North and South America and across the world, is evidence of that. So we want you to know, wherever you are in this world, whatever lineage you come from, you're important, you're part of the church history. We very much need you and want you.
As of 1978.
And you will bless people's lives.
We live in such a world where Google has answers to every question. But is there a way to search church history to find reliable answers and stories? And Andrew from Paraguay added, where are some good online resources to search for doctrinally correct answers beyond the search bar on LDS.org?
There are so many historical discussions online about our history. And most of these discussions produce a lot more heat than light. Be careful about sources of information that just seek to tear people down. Look instead for sources of information that are based on the records left by the people themselves and that seek to be fair to them. It is really easy to play gotcha with the past, to pull a quotation or an incident out of its context and make it look alarming.
It would be foolish to assume that there are no statements from LDS leaders that are alarming even in their context. Again, sometimes bad things are just bad. You can apply all of the context and charity that you can muster, and they are still just bad, wrong, pernicious things for prophets to have taught. Prophets being men of their times is not a compelling reason to justify their immoral beliefs. After all, the church despises moral relativism.
So along with the Saints volume that was published this week, was published online about 100 new online essays called Church History Topics. They tell you more about the events and themes and people and places in Saints. And they even point you to further reading, things not published by the church that can help you increase your understanding. So the church has published a documentary history of the Relief Society and a book called At the Pulpit, which is a book of women's sermons throughout church history. You can find a lot of these stories on history.lds.org. Go to the church history section of the Gospel Library app maybe sometime this week. Maybe download Saints and look at the other resources. I think that you will enjoy them, be inspired, and learn more about the history of this church.
These are all sources that have been designed by the church and for the church. Can anyone honestly claim to believe that these sources will be completely objective and transparent in their reporting? As a historian, Matt should know better than to accept a historical figure's view of themselves as being accurate and honest. A full and accurate portrait of a historical figure requires the outsider's perspective to construct. Such is the case with LDS church history.
And in many areas, maybe even most areas, there really are good and wonderful answers that you can obtain. But in a couple of areas, that isn't always the case. Politics and religion would be true, where it wouldn't be true, where often there is misinformation and where there is an effort to distort things. And so you need to go to credible sources. And that was one of the great purposes for having the Saints be issued, is to accomplish that.
Quentin makes a good point. In politics, parties tend to distort their reporting in favor of their platform. That is why it is best to get news from several sources to get a more accurate picture of the situation. I encourage anyone to view Fair Mormon or the Gospel Topics essays if they want a complete perspective on the historical issues. But you'll never hear the Brethren encourage members to get other perspectives on church history. Only their sources are considered credible, so members are left with only the flattering fiction offered in Saints.
I've struggled for years to come to peace about polygamy in the early church. Why was it necessary for Joseph Smith and many other leaders to practice it? And Morgan from Florida added, what do I tell my family when they ask about polygamy in the early days of the church? They aren't generally satisfied with the, well, we don't practice it anymore answer.
The instruction we have in the Book of Mormon about plural marriage, it's Jacob chapter 2, verse 30, and Jacob says, monogamy is the Lord's wish for his people, and there are rare exceptions where the Lord commands us to practice plural marriage in order to raise up a righteous people. This is the rare exception that Joseph Smith was commanded to instigate in our church history.
Monogamy was once considered sinful by LDS leaders who believed it to be the entire reason for the fall of Rome. At that time, they would have said the opposite of what is being put forward today, that polygamy is the rule on earth and in heaven, and monogamy is the wicked Gentiles' exception. And they could support that belief with LDS scripture too. Several early leaders taught that plural marriage was required for exaltation. Doctrine and Covenants 132 makes it clear that the new and everlasting covenant of marriage required plurality of wives. Everything said here is in direct opposition to the teachings of the church Joseph restored.
Now, as plural marriage was practiced officially for about 50 years, it was always something that people could choose.
The choice was either exaltation or eternal servitude as a ministering angel, but I suppose that counts as a choice.
Now, some of you, I know from your questions, wonder, what does our past practice of plural marriage mean for the afterlife, for what will greet us after this life? Our church leaders have taught us that monogamy is the rule and plural marriage is the exception. And our church leaders have taught us that plural marriage is not necessary for exaltation or for eternal glory.
From reading your questions about plural marriage, I know many of you have questions about Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. A couple things I would say to keep in mind about Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. The first is that we know that at that time there was a distinction between sealings for time and eternity that involve commitments in this life and sealings for eternity alone that only involve commitments in the life to come.
There is some weak evidence that one of Joseph's wives was sealed to him for eternity only. There is no such evidence for his other wives. Any suggestion that his troubling sealings were for eternity only is not based on evidence, but on wishful thinking.
We know that some of Joseph Smith's sealings that appear unusual to us and are difficult to understand fall into that category of sealings for eternity alone and seem to have been about creating links between families in the next life. The other thing I would say is that the revelation to practice plural marriage did not come with an instruction manual.
I have to disagree. Plural marriage came with many specific instructions, all of which were simply ignored by Joseph.
But historical documents do tell us about some of what plural marriage did for the Latter-day Saints. It helped bind the people together because it creates these large family networks. And Kate mentioned that one of the purposes in Jacob chapter 2 is to raise up seed or a righteous posterity. The family history records of the church, which are really extensive, tell us that about 20% of living church members descend from those who practice plural marriage. And we know that throughout time, those families have been a strength to the church.
Many members today came from polygamous ancestors. It does not follow that polygamy was necessary or a net good for Mormonism. Are children born of rape supposed to be thankful for rape? We're here because of it, but that doesn't make it right.
It's clear that there was a lot of sacrifice in those marriages. There was a lot of love and unity, but there was also sacrifice. And they taught their children to sacrifice. And those children of those plural marriages, in the early years of missionaries going out to the world, many, many of them were taking the gospel of Jesus Christ across the world and blessing everybody with that gospel.
Missionaries continue to go on missions and sacrifice their time today without needing the sacrifice of their parents' polygamy to inspire them.
That in the councils of the church, in the senior councils of the church, there's a feeling that polygamy as it was practiced served its purpose, and we should honor those saints, but that purpose has been accomplished and that it isn't necessary.
That must be a nice feeling. How would you feel about removing section 132 from canon, since we no longer follow it?
Why are the accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision a little different? Why do we use the version that we use?
If there was complete uniformity among the accounts, that's when I, as a historian, would become suspicious, because that's just not the way that memory works. Imagine that you tell the story of how you met your spouse or your future spouse in 4 different settings over time, given for 4 different purposes to 4 different audiences. Are there going to be differences? Yeah, there are.
The differences would not include confusion over who your spouse was, how many spouses were present, or your motive in seeking out a spouse. That's the kind of confusion we see in Joseph's encounter with deity.
And if you have questions on the accounts of the first vision, there is a Gospel Topics essay on it. And go read them. They're on lds.org. Take a few minutes this week. Go read the 4 accounts. It's been my experience that doing so will deepen your appreciation of what happened that day.
Joseph F. Smith disagreed, which is why he kept Joseph's only handwritten account hidden in his personal safe for decades.
So Caitlin asks, we know that the early saints had to work hard to build the Kirtland Temple so that the Savior might have a place to manifest himself and restore priesthood keys. With this in mind, would you teach us about the significance of those events and what the Lord would have us sacrifice as young adults so that we can benefit from those keys and feel a greater manifestation of the Savior in our lives?
And then the third was Elijah, who came and restored the keys that we think of as the sealing power, binding people together, children to parents, husbands to wives, all of those sealing powers. And the restoration of those keys was just absolutely essential to accomplish the Lord's purposes. We not only needed the scriptures, the Book of Mormon, but we needed those ordinances.
I found this amusing in light of an earlier statement that Kate made about Joseph beginning polygamy in the mid-1830s. Joseph had a relationship with Fanny Alger around 1833, but it could not have been a sealing, since the sealing keys weren't restored until 1836. One would expect that the sealing power so essential for accomplishing the Lord's purposes would have been given prior to the command to practice plural marriage with Fanny. Mysterious ways, am I right?
Derek from Canada asked, did Joseph translate the gold plates, or was it strictly revelation? And Taylor from Washington asked, what role did the Urim and Thummim play in the translation of the Book of Mormon?
We know that he started with a scholarly approach, and then he turned to a revelatory approach. And with the revelatory approach, he used both the Urim and Thummim and a seer stone to help him with the translation process. And the word translation is still relevant, but also revelation is relevant in understanding what was going on here. Now, the Urim and Thummim, you might have read, mentioned in the Book of Mormon, it was buried with the plates. So when Moroni gave Joseph Smith the golden plates, he also gave him the Urim and Thummim. The seer stone was not buried with the plates. It was something that Joseph had found on his own years earlier that helped him to feel in tune with spiritual revelation. So he used both. Seems like he used the seer stone a little more often.
And yet no LDS portrayal of the stone or its use existed in church media until very recently. It's as if the stone was intentionally de-emphasized due to its embarrassing origin story and hilarious means of operation.
Orson Pratt actually walked in later after the Book of Mormon was finished and published, and Joseph Smith was working on a new translation of the Bible, and he wasn't using the seer stone and he wasn't using the Urim and Thummim. And he said, "Why are you not using the seer stone?" And Joseph Smith said, "When I started this process, I needed them. And I have developed sufficiently. I've built up my translation muscles enough now that I no longer need those physical objects in order to perform this translation process."
Like Dumbo's feather, The stone was useless, and the power was in Joseph all along. Amazing. Well, there you have it, folks. The new correlated narrative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Slightly more honest than version 1.0, but just as buggy.